Today is December 31st, 2022, and my name is Annie Blu. This is the first of a series of presentations on recovering through grief. Recently, I experienced a feeling, a tug, a nudge, however you want to call it, that directed me to move in a particular direction, doing a certain thing. That feeling was strong enough that it got me to now share it with you. The direction and certain thing have to do with exploring the topic of recovering through grief. I am in gratitude to this undeniable impulse that is moving me forward within this exploration of the doorway that grief brings to us. For me, witnessing the rawness of grief throughout my life connected me to my heart and feelings like nothing ever before. Grief recovery continues to lessen the limitations of my mind. I continue to move into the life of my dreams, which includes service, expansion, and inner peace. I believe we are here to grow spiritually and thrive versus just survive. Going with the flow, listening to my intuition, choosing to follow my bliss, and doing what lights me up. I look forward to sharing with you, as this first intro segment, the study of one of the many books out there available to assist in seeing through grief's doorway. The 20th expanded edition of the Grief Recovery Handbook by John James and Russell Friedman is a great primer. Sharing its key points will provide a nice beginning to this journey into recovering through grief. Grief is the normal and natural emotional reaction to loss of any kind. Thus, any feelings that arise are customary and understandable. Intellectualizing grief can be a route that is a dead end eventually. It can lead to an unsuccessful summation of the grief events. Coming from one's mind versus heart to heal grief can persuade grievers to create common and false pictures. Grief stirs up conflicting and questioning feelings. These sentiments are brought on by the end or change in a behavior pattern that has become both familiar and intimate. Sadly, grief is the most neglected and misinterpreted experience perceived by both the grievers and those close to the grievers. Our society is ill-equipped to witness grievers' experiences. A successful framework is necessary for grievers to receive needed, spiritually mature validation fitting to its punch. Some examples of the experience of loss are such: betrayal, death of a pet, death of a relationship, a spouse, a girlfriend or boyfriend, a friend, a grandparent, a child, a grandchild, empty nest, end of addictions, financial changes, positive or negative, graduation, legal problems, loss of control of one's body, loss of a job, loss of marriage, loss of safety, loss of trust, major health changes, misdiagnosis of a health condition or misremedies of a health condition, moving, retirement, and starting school. Grief reflects as heartbreak, even though we may want to surmise it is the brain itself that is hurting. The go-to for social reactions for handling grief have generally been attempted using the intellect, using the mind. These reactions often display as emotionally barren statements from well-meaning, caring relations around us. These more intellect-based statements lead to bewilderment and exasperation, counter responses from the griever. These responses, unfortunately, can dovetail the griever further into emotional isolation. When you witness the grief is subsiding in a good way, you exhibit feeling better, mastering your circumstances instead of your circumstances taking hold of you and your joyousness, reclaiming life's greater significance, releasing the fear of the heartache, affliction repeatedly rearing its wound, having the ability to revisit fond memories without the pang of mourning or sorrow, integrating the acceptance of feeling sadness from time to time, giving oneself permission to voice these sad feelings no matter the reactions that others may offer, finding the ability to forgive others when you know their responses are coming from a lack of wisdom, of grief. One day reaching the time where you can discuss your loss in a neutral and healthy fashion, and acquiring the tools that would have been important to learn in childhood that teach how to deal with loss directly. Grief recovery, when heart embodied, displays as focused attention, intentional thoughts, open-mindedness, willingness, courage, and spiritual maturity. Relationships with friends and loved ones during grieving can go through major changes as well. For example, reaching out for someone who has never been there and still isn't becomes more glaring when grief pain is dominant. This can become more acute during the grieving process, where one realizes the loved one doesn't fit that characterization when seen in the eyes of grief recovery. Thus, less than fulfilling relationships can amplify unfinished emotional business during stressful times of grief. There are those who unconsciously choose not to heal their grief, manifesting a hypervigilant self-armor. The self-protection stance taken from unhealed grief leaves grievers distrustful, interfering in their ability to love and to be open. Examples of other arenas that sidestep grief healing can display as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Each griever's mourning is unique to them, and there is no predictable route. More than likely, the difficulty of grief demonstrates as reduced concentration, emotional paralysis, trouble sleeping, eating modifications, and waves of emotional intensity. Grievers, grief literature, and grief professionals occasionally portray false portrayals of the griever in the moment amidst the intensity of their anguish. The grieving process takes many roads to recovery. With review and reflection, the griever needs to assess the circumstances of the loss and revisit the relationship one had within the loss storyline. Questions that come up to be answered are: will the agony of the person, place, or situation diminish? Or perhaps, is part of the grief related to unfinished emotions? These are both difficult but very important questions for the griever. With grief, one finds they can't solve a problem from the same mindset that created it. In this early onslaught of grief's corridors, those around the griever answer with learned reactions such as, "Don't feel bad. You'll be able to replace what you lost. Time heals all wounds. Just give it time. Be strong for others. Keep busy." The need can eventually become all-consuming for effective information and the development of new habits for dealing with your grief. I have a friend in the throes of grief right now, and he must walk in nature every day to handle the anxiety he finds himself in. Prior to this, he never walked in nature. He is getting rid of ideas that don't work and replacing them with ones that do work. He does this while learning the component parts and necessary skills to create the new habits. An example of one of these old ideas can be believing that our stored ideas are always accurate. It helps to recognize how we attach an importance to the stored ideas that take prominence in our remembrances. Relationships around the griever take their toll. It is important to realize that all relationships related to a loss have a uniqueness about them without exception. Being heard and validated is a necessity for the griever. The grief recovery process can help one discover and hopefully complete what was unfinished in different relationships. Examples of dismissive relationship responses are, "Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about." "Get a hold of yourself." "Keep a stiff upper lip." "You can't fall apart now." "Pull yourself up by your bootstraps." "Don't feel bad. She is not in pain anymore." "Before I cry, let's change the subject." "Be thankful you have another child." "The living must go on." He's in a better place." "All things must pass." He led a full life. "You'll find someone else." "God never gives you more than you can handle." "It was not meant to be." "You're strong enough to handle it." "You and your wife should be grateful you can have other children." These direct the griever to invalidate one's feelings so as not to feel the way one feels, because sad, negative, or wounded feelings are simply not acceptable. Societal pressure too often sends the message to act recovered, even though the griever is far from that reality. Many grievers encounter difficulty using the word death, thereby hampering a healthier grief recovery path. By not acknowledging this word, a griever can veer themselves off successful recovery of their anguish. Unresolved grief erodes emotional communication. Incomplete emotions consume massive amounts of one's energy, resulting in silent melancholy and despondency. Clinging to negatives results in torment to the griever. Griever's depression that often enters in as part of the grieving process has similarities to clinical depression. Thus, the griever can be diagnosed as having a clinical issue, rather than recognizing it is the grief itself creating the depression. The griever depression exhibits as a reduced state of energy and/or feeling. Some choose medical solutions with grief depression. Within the sometimes crushing walls of grief, it can be easy to choose paths that may divert and distract, possibly waylaying the path to recovery. The feeling of anger, feeling discounted, and feeling forgotten easily becomes hypersensitized for the one grieving. Some express anger at God as a response to the untimely death of something or someone. Differentiating between one's feelings and one's faith are questioned during this process. Faith, a key spiritual component, rules out reason. Reason tends to shift the griever to the past or to the future, versus planting one's feet in the present moment, opting for faith as the guiding light to eventual acceptance and healing. With the death of something or someone important in one's life, spiritual faith can feel crippled and shaken. Grace enters in when one realizes one's innocence and one's faith can never be lost or shattered. permanently. Faith organically regains its recognition with learned self-compassion and self-witnessing. As nations have chosen to build statues and shrines to fallen leaders, enshrinement manifests amongst grievers too. Fond remembrances and obsessively building tributes to what died and or ended can be an additional deterrent to grief recovery amidst the bridge it also offers to the mourning process. Above all else, grief takes time. Each griever's journey is unique. The recovery process of grief turns its corner as one takes responsibility for their own recovery. This begins with recognition that a problem exists that is directly tied to loss. Lastly, commencing with the action steps to further the grieving process along towards a completion scenario. There can be additional increments of grief that arise, but with the self-responsibility of one's own grief recovery and the ability to discuss the loss in a neutral and healthy fashion, the griever can transcend the grief's imprisoning walls. So to finish off, I picked a card from my tarot deck, and it was a major arcana card called the Death Rebirth card. And my appraisal of what this means in relationship to what I just shared is that great change in lifestyle as part of where grief is within mankind's world right now. Grief is so paramount in so many different arenas right now, many of which I listed while talking about this, and it's huge. So it's a biggie for all of the human species right now. Great changes in the view of oneself at this time. There's such a redefinition and redefining of everyone's identity at this time. We're being rocked and riveted in ways we never have before, and having to really step up into the plate of who are we now? You know, what is my role? Why am I here? What can I do? You know, so there's a lot of grief about letting go of what life was like before COVID and what life is going to be like now. And great change in the view of the world. This card shows a red hooded cape over a body, and inside the face is a beautiful landscape with a bright light shining in an exquisite blue sky. And what this signifies to me is that there is a doorway and a portal that grief provides. And as people go through it, which there is no set time on something like this because grief has its uniqueness, but that there is when you go through grief's doorway, there's a other side to it that will feel like beautiful bright light in a beautiful blue sky. And yeah, so we're going to continue with understanding the death rebirth part of this and see where our next presentation takes us. I'm going to do a New Year spread that shows where grief was in the last year and where it's going to for this next year. So it's really neat to look at and to really understand grief from a greater, bigger picture. So I look forward to meeting with you again and continuing this process of grief recovery. And I'm going to bring in different people that have their experience, can share their experiences of their grief process, which there's a lot of really big stories out there for people to have the opportunity to share how they weathered and how far they've come in the work that they've done to walk through that doorway. And I also will be providing ones out there that are supporting through different modalities to make the grief recovery path a little bit more tenderly comforted as they go through this process. And I am grateful that you're here today. I wish you a beautiful 2 weeks before we meet again. And thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.